nothing theoretical or academic. We really just wanted to have time to be able to discuss these things, because we started to realize that more and more people are going into these intersections. So we're very happy to have you here today, and welcome to another African Research and Knowledge Hub seminar. Our goal as the African Research Knowledge Hub is always to foster research collaboration, to bring together people from different disciplines and see what magic can grow in the in-between space. I really like this setup because we're all coming from different areas, and I think that the liminality is where things can really grow in amazing ways. So thank you for joining us here at Rhodes University Library, and also thank you for joining us everyone online. We're very lucky to have Joshua Matanzima, the founder of the Africa Research Knowledge Hub, who is joining us from Australia. And in the Eastern Cape, it's raining very heavily after a very long time of drought. So we can say Kamako for the rain to also be joining us here today. Our guiding question today is very simple. How can conversations with animals, plants, and other living beings change the way that we think, research, and collaborate? Multi-species studies is emerging as a very vibrant field that cuts across disciplines like environmental anthropology, history, geography, ecology, science and technology studies, and environmental humanities. But it's more than a new intellectual trend. It asks something quite demanding of us. What if animals, plants, microbes, fungi, soils, insects, landscapes, and the more than human are not merely objects of study, but participants in knowledge making? What happens to our research methods when we take seriously the agencies of non-human beings? And what becomes possible politically and ethically when we reimagine research as relational rather than extractive? Today's panel brings together scholars working across history, anthropology, environmental science, and science and technology studies. What unites them is a commitment to thinking with, rather than simply about, other species. This conversation is also about collaboration. Multi-species research often exceeds the boundaries of single disciplines. It pushes us to experiment with methods, to rethink categories like nature and culture, and to question inherited ideas about expertise, authority, and even what counts as knowledge. In that sense, this panel is both conceptual and practical. We're asking not only why multi-species thinking matters, but what it looks like in practice, in archives and laboratories, in fields and farms, and in communities. So I'm just going to give you a short introduction to the speakers for those that don't know them. We have Associate Professor Michelle Cox joining us from the Department of Anthropology at Rhodes University. Michelle is an environmental anthropologist whose work explores the entangled relationships between people, plants, animals, landscapes, and ecological systems. Her research engages indigenous knowledge, biocultural diversity, ethnobotany, environmental governance, and the lived meaning of nature, culture, and land. Working at the intersection of anthropology and the natural sciences, Michelle's work exemplifies multi-species research in practice. She attends to how knowledge is co-produced across human and non-human actors, from medicinal plants and livestock to conservation regimes, and how these relationships are shaped by history, land tenure, and environmental governance. She brings to this discussion a deep engagement with how communities interpret and inhabit changing ecological conditions. Joining us online, we have Prof. Jiahue Lee, who's joining us from the Science and Technology Studies of Global South at the University of Beirut. He's an anthropologist and SES scholar whose work explores how science, expertise, and multi-species relations are configured in post-colonial and global South contexts. Through research on human-animal relations, pest management, and scientific practice, He examines how boundaries between human and non-human are produced, contested, and destabilized. His work invites us to see laboratories, farms, and everyday environments as sites of multi-species negotiation, and to reconsider what it means to be human in a more than human world. Joining us online from UCT is Dr. Maya Marshak, who's joining us from the Department of Geographical Science. She's a scholar and an artist working at the intersection of agroecology, food systems, and environmental justice. Her research critically examines agricultural technologies, seed systems, and small-scale farming, asking how these different knowledge systems, scientific, local, embodied, shape ecological futures. Maya's work treats agriculture as a multi-species arena where plants, soils, farmers, microbes, and markets interact. She brings an interdisciplinary and a very creative approach that challenges extractive research models and foregrounds relational participatory methodologies. Then we have Dr. Craig Patterson, who is a lecturer in the History Department at Rhodes University. His work focuses on environmental and more than human histories. His current research deals with multi-species infrastructure and archival readings of landscapes by walking. Recent work includes looking at former elephant pathways on foot in the Southern Cape indigenous forests, with a particular interest in the ways in which imperial and industrial infrastructures like roads and railways were built using pre-existing multi-species pathways. It asks how this can deepen our understanding of the continuities and conflicts from the pre-colonial into the colonial period through a re-examination of the infrastructural projects through the elephant's experience of colonization. He has also worked on indigenous horse racing in the Eastern Cape, cannabis, soundscapes, land claims, and microhistories of various sites around the Eastern Cape, most recently, virality of plants and animals from cats to cacti in the Eastern Cape, which I really love as a title for a book. So we're just going to give each of the panelists a chance to present their work, to give 8 to 10 minutes. Then we're going to answer some focused questions, and then we are going to open the floor to discussion. So over to you.
Thank you, Jamie. And I'd like to begin by saying I think Jamie's given too much justice to what my work has been doing in this field. And the reason I say this is because this is actually a new lens or inquiry that I've actually only just discovered very recently, and it was through a change in our curriculum within the anthropology department with the focus on the non-human that I actually got exposed to this literature. And in hindsight, I only wish I'd actually known about this long ago. And the reason I say this is because I think it would have added a whole another dimension to my work, which was very much involved in looking at, particularly here in the Eastern Cape, people's, or how local communities, what kind of attachments they had to the natural world and what informed those. But again, I have to be honest, I used a very human-centric approach and just attempted to understand how what is informing local communities' understandings of those attachments. And I actually didn't dig deep enough to actually let the voices of the non-human or the natural elements give them a voice in the space. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time in this seminar to actually draw attention to what the discipline of anthropology can bring to these studies. And here we do need to give a little bit of background because, I must admit I thought I was going to be speaking more to students, so bear with me. But I do think it's important. Anthropology has been very much the study of humans. And And within that framing, obviously, humans were at the center of the universe, and all natural elements or utilization of that and the relationship that humans had with nature was very much how it benefited them, what they got out of it. So so the natural world was very much perceived as a resource, and that was it. You know, there was nothing more than, how it contributed to us. We are now seeing a major shift in our thinking, and anthropology, and please take note, anthropology students, you are no longer just studying humans, you are actually studying the web of life that makes us human. And just that shift in thinking allows us to see us not from a human-centric view, but to a decentralized one. And that then makes it possible to think about the kinds of ways in which other species are actually active participants in life, and are contributing to the way in which the social worlds we construct, our economics, as well as our medical lives. But obviously, to get to this major theoretical shift, a lot of things had to be challenged. And one of the key things, particularly within the discourse of anthropology, was that, human beings are not exceptional. There was this huge, massive drive, particularly in the early 1900s, to define what makes humans exceptional. And a lot of emphasis was obviously placed on, that we have culture, that we have language, and we are active agents. And the more and more people or researchers actually looked at animals or other species, they actually realized, these characteristics are not what makes humans exceptional. We are seeing other species, even at the lower, this is now scientific discourse, but they have a hierarchy of taxa of how to distinguish different species, but I mean, we are even seeing that trees are communicating with us. And as soon as you give recognition to a species being able to communicate, you begin to also see possibilities of languages existing within other species, that it's not just within humans. And this is making, or with that acknowledgement, we are now seeing more research being done amongst other species, and as a result, we are seeing that there are actually quite elaborate forms of language that are existing. For example, whale species, they are able to, the forms of language are, when it's decoded, it's possible to see that they are having different names for different individuals. And from the songs that they are singing, they are able to say where they have moved from, where they are moving to. And so communication amongst animals is not just simply about, where the next meal is, or I need to get away from this animal. There's actually a whole, there are many ways of expressing. And with that acknowledgement, we are even now seeing through work that is being done amongst animal species that there are even cultures, because as soon as you give acknowledgement to a language, it means that they have cultures and are creating social worlds. And we have seen that now elephants, when one of the young die, they are now mourning, and even hold funerals for the death of loved ones. And this is why culling of elephants is becoming such a huge thing. We are not just getting rid of excess species, but when animals are being culled, it's actually a form of genocide. And this has huge ethical implications. But what is contributing significantly to enhancing our understanding? So it's not only the work that is being done amongst or with animals or other species, it's also the recognition of knowledge held within other ontological ways of being. So, for example, amongst many indigenous communities, there's the ontological understanding or premise that nature and culture coexist, and within that framing, humans are not separate from nature, but are actually an integral part. Sorry? Yes. So that becomes, obviously of importance, and within that, the natural elements are then perceived also as holding characteristics of being human. So within that, we have these major theoretical contributions from work of Donna Haraway, Anna Singh, the mushroom at the end of the world, and Donna Way's companion species, which shows, we don't only have relationships with our pets, we even have relationships with bacteria in our gut, and our existence is around, evolves around those kinds of relationships. And we also have some major contributions from South Africa happening in this space. For example, Jane Cartharis' work on the Kruger Park shows that nature is often a site of human dispossession, and conservation isn't natural, it's a history of who is allowed to be in the wild. And we also have work that is being done by Nomalanga Mkhize, who is showing, particularly here in the Eastern Cape, that cattle aren't just livestock, they are central to the social identity and the rural economy, and therefore are actual social agents within families. They are not just an economic resource that people have. And Leslie Green is bringing attention to us that plants, particularly those that are used within the medicinal plant trade or used as muti or amayeza, they don't just hold chemical enzymes, but they're also an active participant in the dialogue between the healer and the patient and the ancestor. So do you see how the shift in thinking has really moved us away from seeing the environment as a static backdrop, but it's one in which it becomes a space of negotiation, but we also no longer just have to, we don't just now have a responsibility at an ethical level of human rights, we also now have to look at multi-species justice and actually find policies that contribute to flourishing for all. And that also then comes to my concluding slide, which is that the future is going to be about how we live with multi-species. This idea that the world is only about us and our role in the world is no longer, just isn't the real reality, and that we need to recognize that we are sharing a home with these multiple species. So we are not just saving nature, we are learning to live with our kin. And anthropology has done a lot in contributing to those discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I really like the idea of kinship. I think that's something we can take forward. Can we go online now to Prof. Jia? Are you able to share, if you want to share?
Hi. Sorry, is it my turn?
Yes, it's your turn.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I don't have any slides, so I will um, be looking at all of you and sharing my work. Thank you so much to Joshua and Jamie for the invitation, for bringing us together, and greetings to all of you online and those in the room in Makanda. I'm very happy to be able to share my work and say a little bit about um, how I became interested in multi-species anthropology. So as a way of situating myself, I'll sort of start by saying that in Malaysia, where I grew up, there were lots of stories that children would often listen to. And these are stories about animals that can speak. So one very popular character in these stories is the mouse deer, which is a tiny little um, deer-looking creature that is said to be incredibly intelligent. And the mouse deer, would outwit the tiger, outwit the python with its cleverness, and try to escape from the jaws of death, quite literally in these stories. And this mouse deer character has a lot of similarities with the character of the rabbit or the hare in East African stories. And so in East Africa as well, there are lots of stories where the sungura or the rabbit or the hare is a tiny creature but incredibly intelligent. And stories are being told about how the rabbit or the hare would outwit the predators, the lion, um, and find really clever ways to save itself, usually from the jaws of death and predatorship. And so I start with these stories to also highlight, I think, what Professor Cox had also said earlier, that in many contexts around the world, and also in the Southern and Eastern African context, there are already a rich legacy, a rich heritage of thinking and storytelling where animals play a really important role in helping people think about morality, ethics, how to be with each other, how to be with the environment. So I would like to start there and sort of say that yes, I think these academic and research questions can be quite new or quite um, uh, emergent in the context of an academic discipline, but that people for a very long time have been thinking with animals, non-human animals, to figure out things and create meaning and to create ethics in society. Another example that I also like to share, and this comes much more closer from the context of the Eastern Cape, but also parts of East Africa, is the honey guide bird. So the honey guide bird is a bird that many communities have worked with over centuries to look for honey. And the way that this happens is that there's a conversation that happens between the bird and a person, right? So a person understands the call of these birds, and there'll be different types of calls which would provide different types of meaning. So you could interpret a call as as saying something, come follow me, or it's this way or this way. And a person could then follow the honey guide bird towards a tree trunk or a bee nest. And from these places, a person is able to collect honey. And as part of the reciprocal relationship between the bird and the person, whoever who collects the honey will always leave just enough honey for the bird to enjoy and to then also feast on or eat. And the human person would never be able to find this honey without the help of the bird. And the bird would usually not have access to the honey because the honey is usually um, hidden in tree trunks or behind crevices in rocks that are really hard to get to. So it requires the help of the person, the human person, to break apart the tree trunk and make the honey available to the bird. So again, this is to sort of point out that looking just around us, in our communities, in our environments, there are already a lot of human, non-human, multi-species relationships that are already taking place. And I think it's a very interesting way to also think about culture and to think about how people relate to their environments through these experiences, and some of them are centuries old. And so that's how I started becoming interested in my own research project. So the one that I'll highlight is the research project that I spent 2 years during my PhD to research. I spent 2 years learning how to be a rat trainer, training rats in a NGO project that's based in Tanzania. And in this project, we train rats to detect landmines and tuberculosis. So using behavioral training that also sort of similar to how you would train a dog as well to detect landmines. And you would use these techniques to create a relationship with rats and then be able to teach rats to then look for the smell or the odors of buried landmines or the volatile organic molecules being released by tuberculosis bacteria to detect them and find them and locate them. And then the rat would then communicate the presence of these smells to the human person that they're working with. And then this would constitute a sort of human rat team that is then looking for and locating landmines or making a diagnosis of TB from a sputum sample. And so in these relationships, what I was also very interested in is that I was trying to also ask the rat trainers, and by being a rat trainer, by learning how to be a rat trainer myself, learn about what are the types of behavioral signs that I would be paying attention to. You know, how do I learn to be attentive or sensitive to the ways that rats move and behave, and how do they interact with their surroundings, and use this information as evidence or as data that there is a landmine buried underground, or that the sputum sample is positive for tuberculosis. And I realized through as I was learning how to train rats that the Tanzanian rat trainers bring a lot of their own relationships with livestock, so with cattle, with chickens that they rear, and they bring a lot of experiences from living with these other animals and taking care of these animals to the way that they teach and train rats. And so for me, as somebody who did not grow up living with animals, I learned how to then learn from my colleagues how they live with cattle, for example, and then transpose that knowledge onto learning how to read the body and the movement of rats in these projects. And so that's one sort of methodological learning that I had to do as a multi-species anthropologist.
Sorry, Prof. Lee, you've got 3 minutes.
Great. And by way of concluding that, I think too that because these, at the place where I did my research in Tanzania, people were already constantly growing up and working with animals, thinking about other animals and the relationship between humans and other animals was not that novel or new or interesting to them. And so then what became the focus of my research question was where and how people drew boundaries, or where and how people differentiated between humans and other animals. And so the way that I sort of reached this conclusion is to also look at the ethical and moral implications about how people versus animals should be treated as living sentient beings. And this involves also a lot of questions about economic livelihoods and human dignity. And so that is where sort of the conclusion of my research is to show how people draw boundaries rather than how people live with other animals, because they actually live with other animals a lot already. And so the important thing to them is how to differentiate humans from other animals. So I'll end there and happy to discuss more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Lee. I just this morning watched a film from the point of view of tracker dogs that were being that had been trained to find otters. So I think there are these amazing relationships going on all of the time, and it's also about the storytelling to share those relationships, where I think your work comes in a very big way. Thank you. We're going to go now to Maya.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Such interesting work. So nice to be here. Thank you for the invite. See if I can share my presentation.
Do you know how to do it?
Which computer are you working from? That's actually
I don't know. It's doing something very strange. It's not really letting me share it.
3 dots. Click on those 3 dots by hand.
3 dots. Okay.
Should I send it to you, perhaps? Or I can just speak to it. But it's a pity because it's much more visual than words.
Okay, we're investigating if we can figure out how to allow you to share.
I think there's some extra security settings or something on.
Go to the people at the top, and then you might be able to, and then they'll come up on the right. Maybe you can give them more access then.
3 dots.
Spotlight for
Joshua, are you able to make Maya a admin?
Yeah, I've done so. Can you check if the share button is live, Maya?
Where is the share button? There. But that's from our side.
It's live, but it's still not letting me share.
Organizer. I think she has to be classified as an organizer.
Where do
Can
I
you
do
make her
that?
an organizer?
Otherwise, I can email it to you quickly.
Yeah, please
Okay.
email it to me and then I can share it for you.
Okay, so in the meantime, maybe let's
Thanks,
go to
Joshua.
Craig
Yeah, thank you.
while we're doing that.
Right. Jamie, just tap me on the foot if I carry on or if I veer off. All right.
Or both.
Or both, yeah. So picking up a bit on what Michelle said first there, where humans have thought of themselves as the center of the universe, as very special. For a historian, even if we destabilize that, you still encounter a problem. Because for a historian trying to write a history of, or an animal history, let's call it, rather than a history of animals, all of the evidence that we would traditionally use as historians is written by humans who think that they are special, right? So for a historian, that's the core of the problem here, right? So what I'd like to just quickly fly through, which I'm not very good at because historians are wordy types, is give you an idea of how I got into multi-species stuff and tell you a bit about what I do and how I do it, right? Multi-species histories are generally falling under the broader category of environmental history. And I've been in environmental history basically my entire career. I've always been interested in this connection between a plant species or an animal species and humans. in human society. That started in my MA, which was my first encounter with the theory of the cannabis plant, where you've got Cannabis sativa, that's the species. Now sativa means cultivated, right? So you've got the species actually defined by its relationship with human society. That's kind of where this thinking started. It was just after that that I read a book called Maize and Grace, which is a history of maize in Africa. And McCann, I think it was, who speaks a lot about the sort of plant-insect-human nexus, right? I was also doing some work after my MA on Indian Ocean islands. And there was the story in Zanzibar where the British brought in a few breeding pairs of crows. And they released these crows to eat the insects on the clove plantations. But the crows didn't really like the rural environment. They were like city crows, so they go off to the city and they start scavenging there. And they start picking up bones and they drop the bones on the roof. And then the rain comes and it pushes the bones into the gutters and clogs the gutters. And that makes a perfect breeding pool for mosquitoes, and then malaria goes through the roof. You know? And for some reason this kind of captivated me, and I couldn't really articulate it at the time, but little did I know that I was starting to get introduced to the idea of assemblages. And now we work a lot more with these assemblages. I don't think it was a very common phrase at the time. It certainly existed, but it wasn't a very common phrase. So I started looking more at the relational aspect of humans and plants and animals. And when I started doing my PhD, I focused on horses. I'd never actually sat on a horse at the time. But it was through that I started to think a bit differently about animals. And we already started to look at animal histories. And part of animal histories is trying to figure out how to give the animal due credit, how to actually see it as an agent of history, as an active participant in historical processes. And I started to see these different, I want to say personalities, but even the word personality makes it humans special, you know, only humans are personal, it's only sort of not a person, right? So I started to try and take individual animals seriously, looking at their individual characteristics and how they all fit together with humans. But by the time I had finished my PhD, I was quite frustrated with animal histories because a lot of people speak about writing from the animal perspective, but no one ever really does it. You know, it always seems to be an add-on in history. And I think that part of the issue there was this lack of evidence, that how do you actually write an animal history if you're always looking at historical evidence from the human's perspective, right? So that led me to elephants. How it led me to elephants is a long story, but I decided to try and figure out how to write this elephant-centered history. And I wanted to look at the relationship between elephant and koi. And then I realized that it was absolutely impossible to write this history because these koi and elephant in the area that I was trying to look at, which is in the Southern Cape, so incorporating like Meisner Forest and the mountains around it, and up into the Bavians, these were people and animals that were actively running away and trying to avoid settlers. And if they're actively running away and trying to avoid settlers, the only evidence you're going to find of them is when they come into conflict with settlers, right? So I tried to think of a way that I could investigate this thing. And I figured that literally the only way I could think of to do it was to go into the forest and just walk around and see what I could find. So I started to look at stories about old elephant pathways around the forests. And I deliberately went with these kind of rumors rather than where you would usually start with just archival searches. And after I had identified a couple of locations that a few people spoke about, I went out to these places and found these old elephant pathways and would walk down them just to see what I could find, right? So I didn't want to start with the archiver. I deliberately wanted to orientate the research that it started from the elephant's position. That was my kind of thinking, right? And I was absolutely astonished by the things that I found there, and just what you are able to see. You notice different plants grow at different roots, how they go from A to B, and things that really should be kind of obvious. You realize that they can tell you something, that they're part of a story, that they actually are evidence. You know? I'd find places where old homes had clearly existed, but there was no sign of the house. There was just the middle of the forest, and it's full of lawn grass. And you know that that lawn grass is not indigenous. It's an exotic variety of grass. The only reason it could be there is because that was a lawn. You know? You're walking through yellow woods, and all of a sudden there's an oak tree just sitting there. You know? So it's that sort of thing that you start to pick up on. And after a while of walking, you start to notice the logic of these routes, and you start to see, hang on, I can see why this path is here and not there. I can see what they're going to, I can see what they're avoiding. Just from the locations, just from understanding like, what the layout of the whole forest is, right? I'm going to skip on a bit because I can, feel free to ask me more about that. I can carry on about that for ages, right? So basically what I managed to put together eventually was this story of how elephants responded to colonial violence and colonial intrusions, right? And what I saw there was that the change caused by colonization had precipitated these changes in the way that the elephants moved, that they changed their pathways in response to that. So you can look at the elephant pathways and from that go back a step and see what they were doing and how their life changed, their life worlds were changed by the encounter with colonization, right? So that process gave me a lot of hope. I mean, obviously not for humanity, but for using this kind of walking method as a way to read the landscape, to read for and have a conversation essentially with animals by looking at the traces that they left behind, putting that together, right? So that brings me up to about 5 years ago, and working on this walking method and trying to figure out ways of doing multi-species histories, I started what I call reconnaissance missions. It's not nearly as militaristic as you would think, right? But essentially it's experiments in evidence, in trying to figure out how we can read evidence that's sitting on the land in order to do multi-species work, to actively center the animal. Now, I'm not trying to remove humans. There was a quote from, there's a German media theorist called Kittler, who described his work as trying to remove the human from the humanities. I'm not trying to remove the human, but I only want the human to be incidental in the humanities that I'm doing. So I start from outside the human, and if I'm led back into that, if the evidence leads me back into something like it did with the Elephant Project talking about colonization, I'm happy to go there. But to try and orientate your thinking and orientate your position, that you work from the animal side first and see where that leads you to give a proper kind of multi-species approach, right? So what I'll do now with these like reconnaissance things is essentially experimental microhistories, right? And I'll hear stories about different sites and I'll go and I'll try and investigate it. So someone will say like, you know, a town is abandoned because of a cactus, right? And you're like, okay, I want to hear more about that story. How did this happen? Go out there and you figure out what the situation is. Another case, and you'll know this one, it's like, where a sacred pool can no longer be used because it's overrun with water weeds. An insect is introduced, destroys the water weeds, and now the pool can be used again. What are the implications of that? Like, how does that work? You've got an insect and human collaboration going on here. Yeah. Hello. Right. Yeah. So my work in trying to take this kind of multi-species history seriously very often finds itself in some methodological ground. How do you build this evidence? How do you take evidence from the animal side to try and put the story together again? Yeah, I'll stop.
I know from most of the discussions that Craig and myself have had, which have made me think a lot, is he will find things like sound recordings and then start to look at what other than human voices are in those recordings which have previously been completely neglected. So there are these layers of forgottenness that we can start to enter those abandoned ruins, I think. Yeah, so very exciting work. Feel free to ask Craig more. Maya, are you able to share?
Looks like it's fine. It's jumped around a little bit, but it looks fine enough. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. Such a fascinating set of talks. So I've just prepared like a very short little presentation on the work I've been doing around insects and changing agricultural knowledge landscapes in South Africa. You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Joshua. So this work really started in a project which was looking at the impacts of hybrid and GM seed and their co-technologies on agroecological knowledge and practice in South Africa. So there's been a lot of work on looking at either the social impacts of GM and hybrid seed or the ecological impacts, but not so much looking at the interrelationship between socio-ecological systems. And this project was really born out of a science and technology studies kind of approach, looking at the politics of technologies in landscapes and in social ecological systems, and the way that these technologies are rooted in industrial colonial kind of ways of thinking and ideas of extractivism. So the multi-species method, I think, is something that was really exciting to me to try and bring in. I didn't know what that meant at all when I started this research. I just knew that I wanted to look at the meeting points between all living things in the space, and look at the way both scientists working in research and development. I was focused on maize, and farmers working in maize, how their relations with all species had been changing with the introduction of new seeds and technologies. Can go to the next slide. And at the beginning, I was really just looking at the meeting points between all things I could find, and that was a very fumbling kind of methodology of just spending time in laboratories, on farms, speaking to lots of people, anyone who worked in any way with to do with maize and other species, maize being one of them. And insects, I think, emerged very early on as kind of protagonists in the story. And I started to notice insects and the relations with them, the way the farmers were working with insects over time and how this changed, and the way that scientists were working with insects over time and how that had changed. And I really like these two insights from Bizo and Al, who talk about how focusing on these tiny creatures that often trouble coexistence can bring understanding of how humans inhabit specific spaces and moments in history. Tracing the lives of these small creatures and how we interact with them can reveal much about society's relationship with the natural world and how it is changing. So that's sort of what I was trying to do. And then next slide. So just paying attention to insects and how people were working with them. I don't know if you would call this a classic multi-species project, but I think there's an element of that in there. I think what you were speaking about before around the idea of just kind of abandoning your own ideas and trying to go into the space and notice it in a different way with different species. I think it really started. Two insects really stood out as storytellers in this whole process. One was the stem borer, who are a very voracious pest, seen as a voracious pest on maize in maize farming. In fact, they are the target insect for BT maize, so they are a very big part of the story of genetic modified maize. And kind of combating this insect is why the BT maize became so popular. Of course, what the insects were able to tell me was a story of how, with the introduction of more generic pesticides and then the BT maize, which targets the stem borer itself, really overnight changes the story of what is necessary to look at, because the maize is doing the pest control itself. And so humans then don't need to know as much about insects as they used to. And so through looking at the stem borers and the research and how that changed over time and how farmers were working with insects and how that changed over time, I was able to tell the story of like an unraveling of place-based knowledge and unraveling of kind of complex knowledge around this insect on farming in maize farming systems. An entomologist told me how almost overnight the research landscape changed. Whereas researchers were doing sort of very in-depth research around the flight patterns of the insects and how different types hybrid maize were more resistant or less resistant. There was also kind of complex research happening that became, with the use of GM BT maize, not that useful or relevant. And then another insect that became like sort of a harbinger of the story of disconnect and what the consequences of that was the fall armyworm, which kind of burst onto the scene in 2017 as a species that was new and invasive, and which farmers had very little in South Africa knowledge of because it had never been in our farming landscapes before. And of course, a lot of panic. Some of that on the left, the images are the sort of detritus of what was left when these insects just came and started eating things. Those are some experiments. And sort of in the interviews I was doing, a lot of conversation around, we really have lost a lot of knowledge around these things, and there's a need to rebuild our relational ways of knowing. There was a very little understanding of which insect was which, and farmers not knowing how to identify, even scientists not really knowing anymore because there were so few people able to identify these. Those images at the top are sort of old agricultural pinned insect collections that were kind of in tatters. So what I was kind of seeing through working with insects was these multiple narratives of, I've been using the word deskilling and reskilling, but I don't think that's the right words to be using. I think it's more about relating and relations than about skills. But I think these insects were also pointing to kind of hierarchies of knowledge, the way that science had dominated these industrial knowledge systems, and how there's so many different ways of knowing. Farmers had other ways of knowing insects, other ways of working with them, generations that have been sort of sidelined, much more relational ways of knowing about things rather than sort of experimental based, looking at different details, looking at different scales. And then in the context of changing climates and changing ecologies, and how do we think about, sorry, there's a noise, I'm not sure if someone is telling me to hurry up. Multiple sort of knowledges.
You got 3 minutes?
Okay, great. Yeah, working with different ways of knowing. Next slide. I'm not sure if I'm going to play this now because I don't think we have time. This is an animation that was made as part of the project, thinking about, I don't know if you can hear the sound on it, recording soundscapes and thinking about the different species that are going from like agroecological landscapes to industrial maize landscapes, getting lost. We can go to the next slide. And so then this is where the research is kind of led now, this idea of, okay, we've lost a lot of this place-based knowledge in the context of big industrial farming. In the context of agroecology, how can we think about rebuilding our relations through noticing with insects? And this is on a farm I've been working on for the last 5 years. We've been starting to record through soundscapes and photographs, the kind of not insects, getting to know them, and getting to know. You can go to the next slide. What I really have loved about it is the day and night, getting to know the day and night insects and the different ways that they behave. And I think we can go just very quickly to the next slide. So just the thoughts about working with insects. So the thoughts now is around working with insects, around reskilling and rebuilding place-based knowledge as groups or collectives of farmers that we work together with. The idea of, I think insects are very humbling in that they're so diverse. There's millions of insects, of which we've only, science has only labeled very few of them, or known very few of them, and that they're so functionally diverse, and it's impossible to know all of this. That they really are storytellers in helping us decenter our dualist ways of knowing in industrial systems. And I think more recently, looking at the way that they sense the world, insects have such amazing ways that they navigate and sense space, and how sensitive they are to that being disrupted. And then within the context of that, how agroecology sort of rebuilds worlds, rebuilds pathways. I think that the work around pathways and is very beautiful with the insects and with the elephants. I've been thinking a lot about that insect pathways as well, and the way that they navigate the world, and that we may not know all of them or label all of them, but that we know that in building more diverse, kind of more connected landscapes, we're building more pathways. And then I think different species navigate and exist in different ways in the world, and they kind of attune us to different resolutions, different sensitivities. So yeah, I think that. And then there was another animation, but I was really overshooting my time. So that's all.
Thank you so much, Maya. Maybe we might be able to share those. We have a register here, so if there's something we'd like to share afterwards, maybe that's one possibility. One of my favorite insect storytellers are the Greek chorus of mosquitoes that tell the history of Zambia in Namweli Sopel's The Old Drift. She writes really well about deciding why they were a central character, and I think that sort of way of storytelling is really exciting. When we think also about multidisciplinary work, if you have a story of mosquitoes and you have people coming from entomology and literary studies, African languages, anthropology, sociology, we can start to see these ways of storytelling that are multi-layered and multifaceted. So we have some questions now for the panelists. I think we can try and share those. Okay, so of all of the panelists, we're just going to give them maybe 5 minutes to talk about, is there anything on these questions that is really speaking to them? And we can open the floor to discussion. So anyone can start. What is exciting you the most about multi-species research?
excites me the most. It's so confusing. Not the question. I mean, it's really exciting work to do because it takes so much to get your head in that game. And it's kind of liberating in a lot of ways. I think that's probably what I like most about it. You know, for academics, we tend to think that, like, we have to publish this, we have to get it out fast, we have to think, where will we put this article, what journal is it going to go into? And that leads to a lot of academics playing it safe, I think. And that's basically a synonym for, like, I want a sure thing that's kind of boring. With this work, there's no real option to play it safe. And I think that when you're doing multi-species histories, there's space to experiment. And I feel like the thing that I've gained the most from doing this is I'm not just sitting down and writing history. And obviously I found history interesting, you know, before I was doing this sort of history. But you really need to experiment. And most academics nowadays, you think about, like, you're pitching to get funding from somewhere, or you're writing an article that you want to get published somewhere, you're going in with an attitude of, like, if I know what I'm going to get, then my chances go up. You know, if I can say my outputs will be this and that and the next thing, my findings will benefit society and your niche interest of what society should have in a certain way, then your chances of getting the funding go up. With multi-species work, a lot of the time you have no idea what you're going to find. So it's kind of, you have to go out on a limb. You don't know what you're going to find before you finish the work. And that for me is the best part of it. It's a hell of a lot of fun. You know, you're flying blind. Yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, I mean, I also like what Craig just said. Yeah, and I mean, to me, that is, you know, like what research should be. We shouldn't know what we're going to find. But I think for me, what has been, because I'm being perfectly honest, I haven't indulged or engaged much in my own research, but now looking back through the lens of multi-species research, I mean, I so wish I'd known about it before, but I think what excites me so much about it is how it's providing both the conceptual tools, you know, which science and a human-centric approach can never ever offer, but it's also really bringing to the fore the knowledge systems, worldviews that are held within indigenous communities. I mean, these kinds of ways of thinking are not in any way alien. I mean, it's like so part of everyday living. And I really think, you know, obviously through colonialism, you know, so much of those knowledge systems were suppressed, you know, were seen as being backward or having nothing to contribute. And I mean, we are seeing before our very eyes what a Eurocentric or a human-centric approach has done to our world. Yeah, I mean, it's making it completely uninhabitable with climate change, the ecological disasters, you know, and many of the indigenous knowledge systems hold so much that can actually, I think in many ways, get us out of the mess that we are in, because science alone, humanities, you know, we have created such silos, And they are never, ever going to get us out of this mess. So we are going to have to embrace. So that's what excites me.
Our online panelists, is there any of the questions you really want to talk to? Anything you want to share from the questions?
Maybe I'll add to the conversation that I think there's a tendency in the current multi-species or animal studies literature to talk about conviviality. So the sort of a convivial or this aspiration for having better relationships with non-human animals or plants or insects. And I just wanted to offer a slightly different experience as well. So I think one of the things that was really key for me in learning to be a rat trainer as part of my ethnographic research was being bitten by one. And it was not a pleasant experience. It was very painful. There was a lot of blood, gushing everywhere. But it also, I think, taught me a lesson that creating or trying to bridge the relationship between a person and a non-human animal can sometimes involve dangers. And I think that danger is also a really good place to think about vulnerability, to think about human or non-human exceptionalism, and to also think about what sort of risks that we are exposed to when we interact with other species.
Maya?
I didn't have something specific to say, but I really like this last comment. I mean, I think insects also, like rats, force us to really rethink about how we relate and don't relate. And I mean, I cannot talk about insects in some kind of idealistic way. They cause a lot of harm and damage and fear and pain. And so it is that thing of not, of negotiating the ways that we exist. And yeah, I think the challenge is thinking there.
Okay. Any other points on the questions before we open the floor for discussion?
I was curious about your question, and now I'm trying to find it, about research with rather than research on. And I was wondering about what our need with that is, because we are humans, and I mean, I think we communicate in different ways in different places. People communicate in different ways with animals. But yeah, maybe we could think about that question, because I think I wonder about what the need is with that question, because I think, like many of everyone who's presented, often you don't really know what you're gonna. I almost feel like that question can only be answered as you do it. Like, I don't think you can really know what's going to
Yeah.
figure out.
Prof. Lee, any other comments?
I think I would also love to hear questions from the audience, but I thought what Dr. Patterson was saying earlier about not being able, I think one question the students always ask me when I teach multi-species anthropology is they say like, oh, how do you interview an animal? Like what does that look like? And I think there is I think it's a very interesting discussion to have about what does it mean to do anthropology or history with non-human creatures, and what does it mean to write about them or with them, and to think of them as, I think in the words, Jamie, in your words, collaborators rather than objects of study. I think one way that I try to resolve this dilemma is to think about the ways in which the worlds that we inhabit are constrained and enabled by the actions of these other creatures as well. So going back to the story that that Dr. Patterson said earlier about crows and then mosquitoes, and how those linkages create the world of maybe a world of malaria or dengue that that we then as humans have to contend with. And so paying attention to how worlds are made, not just by us humans, but also by other creatures, is a good way to think of them as collaborators rather than just as objects of research.
Thank you. I think the world is always in conversation with us. I work a lot with rivers, and I like to use the example that a river is having a conversation with us. A flood is a conversation. If you build to try and dam a river, it's going to have a conversation with you. You might not like it, but these things are happening all the time. So any questions from the audience?
A grizzly bear can have a conversation with you by becoming its meal. I was thinking of Werner Herzog's Grizzly Man, and how the guy who tried to commune with the grizzly bears and ended up hanging himself and his girlfriend for dinner. Yeah, they found their heads and things inside the coast. I worry a little bit about romanticism, but I also worry a little bit about anthropocentrism when we talk about animals communicating. Why do we have to use these categories? There's just something different going on. But the other thing I wonder is whether we shouldn't actually think more carefully about humanity, about who we are, even more carefully than we have. And one of the things that we do is we've isolated ourselves in nature. So here we are talking in this little aseptic room. We know a lion isn't going to come and chow us. And we've created these environments, and then, so it's kind of isolation from the world and control. And maybe one of the things informing that is a fear of nature, deep fear of nature, and ultimately of our mortality. And so maybe there's something going on there that we need to think about. The other thing I like is, and I'm thinking about, which is interesting, is the poetic dimension of what's going on. So thinking about how to reconceive and read. So when you talk about a river talking to you, I don't know if I like that image, but I like the fact that it's a different sort of image. It's an image that we can start thinking about. And these images, I think, the poetic dimension is hugely important for us being able to. But the poetic has material parts, so that our poetry, human poetry, which might not be very pretty poetry, but it is poetry in a way, is to build, isolate ourselves, and control and expect. And the question is how to get rid of that. So I think I don't want to talk to the grizzly bear, but I do want to have a level of respect or an elephant that can just crush me, no problem, or a snake. But I love having them around. So I'm just thinking about what should we be thinking more about these, not less. And maybe that will bring us into a sort of understanding of what sort of relationship we should be having. Not like the grizzly man. Yeah.
There's a wonderful film on ghost elephants coming out.
Good. By Herzog as well.
In a couple of days, yeah.
In a couple of days. So
Fantastic.
it's National Geographic, Ghost Elephants, and his wonderful narration.
And then there's History in Time.
Beautiful voice in it.
Yes.
History in Time by the guy who did the Tree of Life. History in Time is incredibly interesting in terms of its way of reconfiguring our understanding of our role and our place.
And I think these are really important to be able to show students as well, these different ways.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
We do show that to our students. They don't know what to do with it.
Okay, so I've got two things, and I hope I can articulate them succinctly. So the first one is I'm interested in the language of more than human, less than human, and maybe because we were at a talk the other day where the speaker was focusing on genocide, and he was talking about how you need to make a person less than human in order to be able to commit certain atrocities. And then it got me thinking about, okay, less than human according to who? And because the way that language is used currently, it means that a group of people have decided that this person doesn't have enough humanistic characteristics or whatever it is, so they're able to do certain things. But then in the way that I'm hearing it, or the little reading that I've been doing on relationality, the less than human means that maybe if I'm using African indigenous knowledges or ways of understanding, being human means this. And therefore the experience that I'm having in this Eurocentric, I want to say Eurocentric, but in inverted commas, is a less than human experience. Because for me, having these collaborative relationships with nature, the symbiotic, is a human experience. It's not more than. Does that make sense? So the baseline is different. And so whether it's less than or more than depends on whose understanding of human you're using. And so for me, it almost feels like a conflation of things. I don't know if it's corrective or if it's doing the opposite. So I'm just throwing that out there to the scholars because you guys obviously know more than me. And then the second thing is, interestingly enough, my reason for coming here is because of AI. Because I feel like that on a technological level is forcing us to have a more than human perception. And so what I'm asking is, I said that this work is interesting for me because it challenges, because it seems that tapping into this would have given us some kind of, I don't know, process or whatever to navigate AI, because it seems that it's freaking us out because there's a more than humanness that it presents, but it presents it in a very human way, which is why we're able to very easily point to the problem to say, this is the problem with AI, this is how it's going to take over humanity, because it's doing it in a way that we can understand versus animals. And because even when we speak about movies where animals are going to take over, their takeover is very humanistic. Like they're going to then realize that they need to come together and then they need to make us slaves, and then it's a very humanistic.
They've been trained on our fears.
Exactly, but it's our fears. It's not racist. And so, what if the trees are the ones farming us for carbon dioxide, and when they're done, they kill us and then they eat us? Like, what if that's what's actually really happening, and we're not the ones that are? How do we know? Because all of our engagement is very skewed. And so, anyway, I'm sorry. But yeah, that's what I think.
I quite like these sort of those papers which are people just figuring things out, saying maybe it's this, maybe it's this. And I think there's a lot to be said to be writing with people from different disciplines. Mm-hmm. There's really exciting stuff with AI happening in South Africa. There's an AI of our own. There's this big push to have a different kind of AI that's not so Eurocentric. So those kinds of discussions and just figuring it out together, maybe it's this, maybe it's this, are really exciting discussions to have, and maybe taking it beyond academia to the conversation or something like that, where it's actually our job to also be publicly figuring these things out. It's really important.
Can I jump in there? Well, yeah. With the idea of the more than human versus let's call it less than human, I think the best way to think about it is looking at where the ideas come from, and that comes from post-human thinking. Right? Now, with post-human thinking, there are basically two main strands of post-human theory and post-human ideas. And the one I'll kind of define as like the cyborg side, and the other side is more like organic and almost tries to lift animals up to make them more human. Mm-hmm. So to broaden the idea of human to include animals. This kind of post in the sense of always already more than the human, right? When we say more than human, we don't mean greater than or less than. We speak about, like, when you mention the trees, maybe they're farming us. A more than human would be, yes, they are farming us and we're farming them. And it's not either or, it's both of those at the same time. It's the human, but more than it. Do you see what I mean? And that actually gets me to talking about Pedro there. Like, I definitely don't want to have a conversation too close to the grizzly bear. And I can tell you when you're working with elephants, like, you are communicating, but you're not having a chat. You know, like, you need to have some understanding of how the communication's going on, else you're gonna die, you know, which is, you know, what you're getting at with the grizzly. And I'm, just from my perspective, I'm definitely not interested in that post-human side that wants to make everything human. I don't want to expand the definition of human. I think we need to talk about humanity in the same way we talk about other species. But the importance of this multi-species approach isn't necessarily the conversation you're having with other species. It's acknowledging those other species as co-inhabitants, that a kind of coexistence needs to be negotiated with. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
I wanted to ask Professor Lee, kind of going off of this idea of which human are you talking about, which you quite mentioned, because I think when we're saying humans are special, we've centered humans, we're speaking about Western humanity, right? So what, for people in Tanzania, what was significant for them in this, drawing this distinction with animals because of a socioeconomic situation that follows from colonialism, which was a denial of their humanity in the first place. So now a necessary anthropocentrism, right, to reclaim that in a sense. They live with animals already, but what are they needing to do, not speaking about human rights or sorry, I actually wanted to not make a comment, but ask the question. What did they say, or how did they conceptualize their differences in a kind of necessary way?
Thank you. Yeah, and that question actually nicely links up with the earlier comment about AI as well, because so one of the biggest concerns that the rodent trainers in Tanzania have is around how much credit as humans they get for training the rats. So because the rats, you know, are such an interesting idea that rats could be detecting tuberculosis and landmines, the media attention of this project has always focused on the rats. And so the people who do the actual labor of cleaning and teaching and training the rats are always anxious about their own contributions to this relationship being erased by the media attention on solely only on the rats. And so this is where I think for them, it wasn't a question of how do they relate to non-humans, how do they relate to the rats, but to what extent is their contribution as rat trainers acknowledged and then also remunerated in monetary terms for the amount of work that they do. And so there's a lot of contestation actually between the trainers, and I'm trying to write about this as well in the book, between the trainers and the management of this NGO, because the trainers feel like their labor is slowly being eroded or erased from being acknowledged and paid fairly. And I think this is also an interesting question that links up to the AI question, where there's a tendency to sort of value or valorize the non-human actors in these situations. And usually this is at the expense of the overlooked or erased human contribution that go into training data sets that make AI really effective. But also same thing with the rats, right? The humans spend almost 2 years per rat, you know, training the rat so that it's able to do the work that is then celebrated for doing.
I was just going to make a brief comment about the AI. Recently seeing something about how it's been used to communicate with animals and understand animal, what we call languages and so on. So actually the AI could be talking straight to the animals without us, so we don't really need to be part of the equation.
Everyone gets to take over.
Will's got a question over there.
But I think was second.
literally.
Age before beauty.
Yeah.
A footnote to Professor Lee's mention of the honey guide. I just read a study the other week about the relationship between honey guides and humans in Kenya, where it appears that in different areas, the people and the honey guides are actually speaking in different kinds of language. That the honey guides are not just honey guides, they are honey guides with dialects, that the calls that they make and their behaviors are specific to specific areas. So, I mean, that implies a kind of culture that we might apply to whales, right? But not necessarily to birds, but they have these cultural differences, even in honey guide populations. And I'm sure that the people are then understanding something about the honey guides that implies that they understand where honey guides are coming from, what it means to be a honey guide. And that leads me to a question about the role of the imagination here. And literature. We can't leave literature out of it. Okay, I'm so glad you mentioned that novel, The Old Drift. I've just read Elif Shafak, The Island of Hidden Trees, and in it she tries to project the voice of a fig tree. So one of the major characters in the novel is a fig tree, and the fig tree speaks, right? Part of the narrative is related by the fig tree. Now, I don't think Shafak quite pulls that off, and I think she maybe missed an opportunity to forward something really different. The tree is too anthropomorphized. It's like the tree can kind of read the local papers, you know, and you think, what's all about that? Although we now know that trees are sentient in all sorts of ways that we've hardly suspected before. But it draws that question of where does our human imagination come in? What are the limits to our imagination? Craig is really writing history, imagining what makes an elephant and why an elephant would behave the way it is. But are there limits to that imagining? I don't think we can do without it, but no.
Yes.
To what extent can we transcend our human locked-inness?
I don't know if Craig wants to respond to that.
Or somebody, yeah.
Or Maya.
I think we're running out of time a little bit.
Okay.
So we can carry on we have treats and eats and everything, so we can carry on some discussions in person.
Dying for a cup of tea.
The tea will be unlocked. But is there some questions also?
Yeah, so maybe just kind of last question. So I come from the post-human world of cyborgs more than organics, gross. And so I'm kind of quite used to thinking about quite dead things acting as agents in the world and so on. And I think that the provocation for me here is really interesting one to sort of think about how does multi-species research deal with the problem of life and death, right? Because death seems to be really kind of catastrophic for species. They don't want to die. They kind of want to reproduce in all kinds of interesting ways and live on. But that sort of points me to a sort of second tangential question, which is about the methodological incursion that's possible from humanities back into sciences in this world, because sciences tend to be these kind of quite dead disciplines, right, that kill things as a kind of look at them. No offense to our science friends. But I think that the imperative of multi-species research or post-humanist research more broadly is to inject the sense of imagination, but also inject the sense of interpretation back into the sciences. And so my question would be to kind of Maya and our sort of people kind of, and Craig as well, sort of working at the frontiers of scientific research, which sort of seems to be describing a world, to kind of ask the question, what happens when we start interpreting the world instead, right? How do we get our science friends to start kind of injecting that liveliness of interpretation back into the kind of scientific discourse, right? Because I think that's the kind of responsibility that the humanities has in this broader academic space, right? And using our animal friends to do it along with us.
Can I just, I mean, I'm not really at all in the field that everybody here is in. But one of the things that worries me is that the science that we have is all about saving human beings. And there's never, you know, we don't have scientific manifestos that say, well, this won't have this is what effect it will have on the environment in any depth. So, for instance, we have insecticides. Yeah, sure, they kill the insects, but they don't think about the fact that the birds need the insects to live. So now we have the populations of insect-eating birds are going down because our scientists are only thinking about human beings. And we've seen the terrible impacts of plastic bags and plastic, and we keep seeing it all over the place. And I don't know whether scientists have ever got to the point where, when they do scientific investigations or inventions or whatever it is, that they're actually thinking about a wider effect of them.
Don't you think that's more economics, like politicians, than it is the scientists?
I think it's
Because I mean,
actually my area is actually law, and I'm interested in animal rights. So I'm just putting that out there as well, that I think that we are thinking about the non-human dimension of all these things. They also need to survive, and our inventions also need to take them into consideration. And if people like yourselves are finding out more about the sentientness of animals, it can only feed into that and make it.
I think ethics is a very big part of it, and maybe that is a topic for another discussion. It's a vital part because it's very far-reaching. I'm not seeing any hands online. Can we give over to Rebecca to...
Okay, well, thank you so much, Joshua, organizing the meeting. Thank you, Jamie, for chairing the meeting so well. And a particular thank you to the panelists, the 4 panelists. I haven't met all of you. I've met the 2 here. I know Maya quite well. I haven't met the doctor before. Thank you so much for the 4 panelists for their amazing contribution, innovative theoretical thinking, and thoughts about methodology as well. And also for those who also joined us online, thank you for that. I really appreciate the fact that people came here today. I nearly didn't make it. I was only coming from sociology, but the rain was... So thank you so much for all attending. We really deeply appreciate it. And I'd also like to thank my 9 MA students. They'll be having the privilege and pleasure of having 3 2-hour seminars on multi-species studies in the month of April. I'm sure they're now invigorated for doing so. And also thank you for the conversation post the panelists' presentations, really invigorating ideas. Regrettably, not a lot of natural scientists here, but I mean, some of the most interesting conversations I've had about potential multi-species research is with the natural scientists. So I wouldn't want to rule them out, so to speak. I really think they may have an amazing contribution they can make. But yeah, so the idea is after this, we circulated a register. So we're hoping to try to engage with you further to see what possibilities may or may not exist about further research, further thinking around multi-species studies. And yeah, just see what possibilities exist, maybe connecting with others in South Africa doing similar research. Michelle mentioned a few who are doing so. And yeah, and let's just see how things go. And we'd organized some food. I don't know whether it's arrived outside or, you know, the MA students would deeply appreciate it. Not that they came strictly for that reason only. But okay, so thank you so much. And we'll further the email conversation initially and try to meet further in person and virtually as well. So thank you once again to the panelists who really made this panel and meeting possible. Thank you so much.
And I think just to close off,